and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Well, Paul Ryan, he has pulled the Republican bill to repeal Obamacare. A stunning day in Washington. He pulled the bill, and neither the president nor the House Speaker were able to wrangle enough Republican votes. Let's go to Washington for the very latest with Stephanie Ramos.
This was President Trump's first legislative battle, and it was a tough one. Even a group of moderate Republicans from the Freedom Caucus, who typically stand behind the leadership, they were even ready to defy the House Speaker and the president on the GOP's first legislative priority.
Further consideration of H.R. 1628 is postponed.
Today, Republicans' last-minute scramble to get enough votes for their health care bill came to an abrupt end as President Trump called GOP leaders, telling them to pull it from the floor.
I worked as a team player and would have loved to have seen it pass, but again, I think you know I was very clear, because I think there wasn't a speech I made, or very few, where I didn't mention that perhaps the best thing that could happen is exactly what happened today.
House Speaker Paul Ryan calls this a disappointing day for Republicans.
We came really close today, but we came up short.
But some Republicans were on the fence.
I haven't been undecided for some time. I've been undeclared. There's a difference.
Others were swayed after changes were made to the first version of the health care plan.
Obamacare's collapsing, premiums are skyrocketing, providers are fleeing. This may well be our last off-ramp on this road to ruin.
And some questioned the rush.
Why in the world does everything have to begin and finish this week?
House Democrats insist there is nothing to gloat about on Capitol Hill this week, even if it has been embarrassing for Republicans.
Today, a victory for the Affordable Care Act, more importantly, for the American people.
House Speaker Paul Ryan says the GOP is going through some growing pains after being in opposition for 8 years. He also says they need to get used to governing. At the Capitol, Stephanie Ramos, ABC News. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. You cannot exaggerate the thud that you heard in Washington today. And in short, the GOP bill just frankly was not popular enough with Republican lawmakers. And according to this brand new Quinnipiac poll, American people weren't sold on the plan either, not by a long shot. As you can see, people disapprove by a nearly 40% margin. That's probably because it could have taken away a whole lot of what Obamacare currently, warts and all, offered. Among other things, the GOP plan would not require insurers to cover substance abuse treatment, mental health services, rehab services, maternity care, preventative care. GOP bill also replaced subsidies with tax credits. That would have made coverage more expensive for most people, not just some. It also would have repealed the individual mandate that penalized people who didn't get coverage. Instead, it would have imposed a surcharge for people who lapse coverage for more than 2 months. It also revamped Medicaid funding, making them block grants instead of paying each enrollee. I want to bring in our panel right now, Scott Vanderhoff. He's a former 5-term Republican Rockland County executive, co-chairman of the Palisades Institute of Dominican College. Dominic Carter, political journalist and author. Michael Tobman, independent political consultant. And Andrew Whitman, our senior political correspondent. We'll get to the politics, and there were plenty of losers today here, and some of the consequences about what happened in almost a surreal environment of what we've seen in the last 72 hours. But let's talk about how we got to where we did, because to me it was political malpractice of the first order. Michael, explain, because you worked for Senator Schumer. Sure. There's a thing called counting votes. That's why you got whips. That's why people, before you bring something to the floor, say, we've got enough, we don't have enough. Not once, but twice they did this. They promised things they couldn't deliver, and the finger pointing began before the final votes were even cast, which they never were. So I've never seen, and not to denigrate county politics, I've never seen on town politics something so amateurish as what we saw. As a guy who does this for a living, do you remember something getting as screwed up as this?
Lawyers know you never ask a question you don't already know the answer to, unless you want to be surprised with bad news. In this case, you don't bring something to a vote unless you know you have the votes. Or, very rare instances, vote your conscience, let's see how this goes. If it's 6 of one, half dozen of another, which certainly rehabbing a $2 trillion part of our national economy is not 6 of one, half dozen of another. So no, this was a rush. This was trying to fulfill a campaign promise. This was a speech. It was grandstanding and posturing, and it was the opposite of governing. But like President Trump said, and this is not getting into the politics of it, healthcare, this is really more complicated. This is very complicated stuff. Governing is complicated. I defer to the county executive. Governing is incremental. Governing is complicated. Governing is compromise, none of which was on display here.
And I want to get to that and the difference between campaigning and governing, two different things. But Andrew was, I know Trump, and we'll get to the blame game in a minute. He blamed Democrats, of course, but look within, because he had enough votes, obviously, in the House to at least get this through there, one would think, just obviously if they voted on the party line. For 7 years, they've been talking about this being the bane of human existence. They won the Congress back by virtue of Obamacare, okay? So they get to today, beyond what Michael said, where they couldn't even count. They had warring factions in their own party. They started off saying, this is the plan. Freedom Caucus should be a surprise to no one. Most of all, Paul Ryan says, not so fast. We want the following. Whether you call it extortion or whatever else, all of a sudden, Ryan and the president started giving him the bennies. But then all of a sudden, on the other end of the spectrum, the moderates, or whatever constitutes moderates nowadays, says, wait a minute, I got to get back home to my district. I belong in a blue state here. You're trying to cost me my job? No way. And they pulled their support. We're hearing they weren't that close at the end of the day to the numbers. They're farther away today than they were yesterday.
Yeah, and piggybacking on what Michael said, they didn't do the head count, and there was a miscalculation by Ryan and Trump that pressure from both the Speaker's office and the president, and then the potential pressure of having to go back home and explain to voters why you weren't able to repeal Obamacare would be enough to put them over the top and enough to bring enough votes into line. That pressure did not pay off. Now, one can make the argument that Trump eroded his own pressure through some of his missteps, through the Russia problems, through the claims about what happened at Trump Tower. The other point that has to be made is this is his first big legislative push. It is almost unheard of, and I wonder if anybody else on the panel can think of another example of an initial push from an administration for one policy that absolutely went nowhere in Congress like this. Even President Clinton's healthcare initiative was a little further into his tenure in the White House. When Obama pushed Obamacare through, it took a while, but he was able to get it done. President Bush, the previous President Bush, again, you have a certain amount of political capital and momentum in your first 100 days. That's where you're supposed to be able to tick off the stuff that you can actually get through. And that gives you some idea of how weak the Speaker and the President are, at least among the Republican caucus, at least on this bill.
You know, Dom, I want to double back for a second to what Michael touched on, which is, as Andrew said, this is the first thing out of the gate, right? They've already telegraphed they're not going to touch health care before the end of next year. They're going to get through the midterms before they touch again. Think about that. He campaigned all the promises. Remember, we're going to make it better. Everybody's going to keep their insurance. It'll be the best thing you've ever seen. The threat yesterday, if you keep this, remember Planned Parenthood? He said he'd lose votes, but he'll support it. He said yesterday, if you keep this, Republicans, you're funding Planned Parenthood, the end of the world as you know it. Well, it's still there right now. I just can't remember, Dom, so many, you don't make promises you can't deliver on. Just like he says, you don't ask a question, you don't know the answer. They told everybody, they weakened themselves. This is the most self-inflicted political misstep I can remember right now. I mean, this was it for Republicans. They voted 60 times or something when they knew they didn't have the votes to try and repeal the thing, when they had Obama as a president would never get by his desk. Now they got everything they wanted. They got the House, they got the Senate, they got the president, and they couldn't even get it out of the House. They couldn't even have a floor vote. Do you remember anything as big of a hot mess as this?
No. Most administrations are calculating, political calculating with people like these to help make these decisions. What we witnessed, not what we are, what we witnessed today is what happens when someone reaches the highest office in the land with no political experience, and the team around him has no political experience. What brain scientists said, oh, let's tackle the most difficult issue that there is right out the gate with midterm elections right around the corner when everybody's up for re-election. This was there was no way, even if it went through, it would have been worse for Trump. Trump tonight is backpedaling the soundbite that you played, Richard, better than Michael Jackson doing the moonwalk. You know, when Michael Jackson, listen to what he said. Right out the gate, when I'm an old man, I will still sit back and look and say, why did he come out the gate and back this, Trump? Why?
In fact, if you listen to him, he said from the beginning, guys, let's not do this now. Let's wait till 19 to do it. The Democrats will be blamed for this. Now, maybe they still will. We'll talk about that next segment. But, Scott, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about what Michael said, which is there's a big difference between campaigning and there's a big difference from governing. Trump promised that he was something different than we've seen in Washington. He was a businessman who knew how to get things done. I remember he said, you're going to be so tired of winning, you're going to be sick of it, right? You're going to see so much of it. I must have missed that, okay? Talk about the difference for people who don't know, trying to get votes, but then when you're in the desk, what you have to do, you have to negotiate, you have to make trade-offs, you have to actually be a legislator.
Yeah, no, it is entirely different. It's black and white, and Michael and Dominic have hit on it. This thing was fundamentally flawed from the very beginning. Why? Because there was a group of people who said you need to repeal it, period. No replacement. And those folks won the day. You need to repeal it. Don't try to become Obama light. And then the whole other group said, yeah, but we're going to lose millions of people on insurance, 20 million or more, and we can't do that for our own self-preservation. You have an immediate problem there. And then you have the third problem, which is what you speak of, which is Trump promised everybody would be covered. He promised. And when he got into the weeds a little bit, he said, remember this? He said, this is complicated. Yeah, it's really complicated.
And you can't blame it. Who could have seen it coming? The Freedom Caucus shut the government down. So we know what they were capable of. If you didn't have them lined up to begin with, why are you running your mouth?
And the fact is, this fundamental differences, they were there all along. So to Dominic's point, the only way to deal with that is to put it on the back burner and let people get involved. Take infrastructure. If you had taken the infrastructure deal, almost everyone, including the Democrats,
they would have argued, though, to be fair to them, they needed the savings from Obamacare to at least justify some of the spendings that would go on. But we'll see with that. I want to take a quick break. When we come back here, the political battle over this. Who were the big losers in all of this? You got two hands? And who were the winners? I'm not so sure we can even answer that one right now. Stay with us. We'll get into what happens next after this.